Okay, we're going to pick back up. We're going to have a few more questions among the panel, and then we'll open it up to audience questions for the last 30 minutes or so. So we're talking about current programming and what we're doing right now, both domestically and internationally. Tricia, can you talk a little bit about the exercises you've gone in and worked on and how we include gender considerations, or do we, and how well that's done?
Um, so in terms of some of our community exercises that we do, so we always have it be a community driven effort. So they reach out to us, to the federal government, as opposed to us kind of imposing our will on them, because we never want to stigmatize or securitize a community. And, essentially bring together the community of interest. So, whether it's the FBI local office, the U.S. Attorney's Office, the city police force, and then with educators, with religious community leaders. I will say that in several of the exercises we've done, when you get a predominantly sort of law enforcement and religious community together, you get very male dominated voices at the table. You get male presence. And so I think even domestically, just being mindful of who's at the table, if we have women leaders, youth leaders especially, they often sometimes have the better ideas, or more actionable ideas at the very grassroots level of how to develop off ramps. So if you have an individual who's radicalizing, who's 17 and his brother's in college and his has a younger sister, he's accessing violent content online, not getting great grades, you stop at that point. And when you ask individuals in the breakouts what to do about it, you get a very, traditional law enforcement response of, well, it's not our role yet until he breaks these laws. In the religious community, you might just get, well, the mother should take care of it. So then we need the mother in the room. So I think that we are very nascent in our efforts domestically, especially on considering gender in CVE. I think there's a lot more, and I'd love to hear everyone's kind of suggestions. Yeah, and youth engagement, I would say as well.
Thank you. And Irfan, to follow up with that, what do state programs look like with regards to gender?
So that's the thing. When you look at, excuse me, state programs, part of it, I think the discussion we had earlier was this idea of roles. And, here we are in the CT Bureau. We're supposed to be counterterrorism. But everyone has a very distinct role in what to play here. And, what the Counterterrorism Bureau should not be the end-all, do-all for counterterrorism programs worldwide. So when we started to look at, again, how to get better at instituting things like prevention or the role of women and gender into the counterterrorism sphere, we had to, I think, get better at defining what those roles were. In the past, we used terms like break down these stovepipes, work more closely with each other. That's fine, but at the end of the day, if you're the Counterterrorism Bureau and you're supposed to do prevention work, some of our civil society folks would get very upset and very, it's a tenuous relationship. So what the secretary decided to do was, let's take a holistic view of what's happening across the State Department. So you look at USAID in particular, you look at our Conflict and Stabilization Office, you look at our DRL office, you look at a lot of these offices that are doing some of this great work, the prevention type of work. How do you weave all that in together? And who's going to be the nexus of activity? Like, where is that node going to lie? So what he decided to do was look at the Counterterrorism Bureau and say, okay, Counterterrorism Bureau, you're going to be this sort of node. You're going to be coordinating and synchronizing a lot of these efforts. Doesn't mean we're going to take these efforts. We're going to coordinate and synchronize these efforts. But to do so, we have to better define your role. And to define your role and help others understand your role, we're going to change the name of your bureau so that people clearly understand what you're designed to do. So it's not just the reaction. It's not just the countering terrorism. It's going to be countering and preventing. So now we are known as the Bureau of Counterterrorism and Countering Violent Extremism, to be very clear in what our role is. So with that, it's not like we started yesterday doing programs that bring into account women and gender. The State Department has a very long history of these type of programs, but now what we can do is take these very traditional programs and push them into the prevention and intervention space so that people can get a better understanding of how it all fits together. How does it fit into the security apparatus? but also how do you get a better understanding of what does CT mean and what does CVE mean and what are our particular roles in those two areas?
Okay, thank you. And so we were talking a little bit during the break too, but there's a constant theme of the nuances of every culture, the need to include gender, not just women, in various capacities, and how basically there's no really easy one size fits all approach to CT and CVE program. So what I'd like to do for the last few minutes here is turn it over to you guys, and if you could envision CT and CVE programming in 5 to 10 years, what do you think it should look like? And you can talk within a cultural context or overall. Just give us an idea of what you're thinking in no particular order.
What you just said, the way I envision it is similar to how USAID has been working on this issue of resilience. So how do we build? For the short history is that in Ethiopia we would have programming to help with livelihoods and agriculture and governance issues, and then we were always surprised when there was a drought. And so we're like, no, one's going to happen every 4 or 5 years. Can we build it into our programming so that we're prepared to respond to this disaster that happens every so often? And so we created a Secretariat of Resilience. We didn't do away with the work that we were doing in agriculture and the environment or governance. And because of the money, they all still needed to report on the indicators for those fields. But the question is, how do those programs come together to not just know about each other, really bring down the stovepipes or silos or whatever the cliche you want to use is, to say how they coordinate, build on one another, and really work together. So that's how I see the CVE space coming with a small secretariat within USAID, is that we talk to those who do economic empowerment or education in some parts. We're just keeping kids in schools, or the youth in governance, and how do they continue to do their work but really go across the sectors to build on one another, taking of course gender into account in all of these, but not pretending that if we have a youth empowerment program and we're having 75%, 85% of the people coming are young men, and we're really trying to talk to them about economic empowerment and how to stay related to their communities, that right from the beginning it was thought of, why did the women stop coming, or at what age do girls drop off to those community programs that we have? Why is that? Their world is getting smaller and smaller because of puberty, because of gender-based violence issues, and so right when we're need to reach out to women and girls, they're starting to fall off. So I think it's kind of coming together. And I used to think before I joined the US government that the first, the mapping exercise that we do first, that was the first easy step. But in many parts, it's really hard. And so, but if we take a step back with the goal, with the intention, I think I really liked Pam's points about this, having your theory of change and leading up to that, not just doing a set of programs and then maybe it will add up to something, but really being specific about the theory, looking at the indicators that we already collect across sectors, but how they come together. And it would be, 5 years down the road, but coming together in that way.
So I would definitely agree that the multidisciplinary idea of programming and focused on resilience, focused on good governance. One program I can think of that I think is maybe a start on the right path is I would say it's characterized by harnessing technology and grassroots efforts and its kind of fluidity. So we have a program that's interagency, that's between it's called Peer-to-Peer Challenging Extremism, and it's an interagency program housed between Department of Homeland Security, NCTC, the White House, the State Department's Bureau of Educational and Cultural Affairs, and then actually working with Facebook as well. And we're looking into expanding with Google. And what we do, we started this a year ago, just a little over a year ago. We started with 23 schools in the US and overseas, and we give them a $2,000 budget, and the students take this class, and it could be a poli-sci class or a tech class, an advertising class, and they're charged with coming up with a local CVE plan. So it could be a plan for their college campus, a plan for their community, a plan for their country, and they have to show their measures of success. They have to define who their target audience is. They have to create the social and digital media environments and the apps. And to me, this is just really makes sense, and it's a smart way of getting there. So we've grown now to 55 schools now, with over 3,000 student alums between the U.S. and overseas, and in places like Pakistan, in Jordan, in Lebanon, in Tunisia. And the students, to me, once we get the government out of the way, the students, and because they're the ones targeted for extremist recruitment, they have the best ideas. They understand the social media environment better than we ever could. They are better messengers than we ever could be as the U.S. government. So I see programming 5 to 10 years out that's really agile, that's very tech savvy, that's very fluid as opposed to just being reactionary, and that's more of a peer-to-peer model.
I would agree with both of you. And I would also offer that I think we're on pretty good footing right now. I think with our new strategy, we're not just, all these disparate offices and disparate pieces of the puzzle trying to put, governance programs, into a round hole of CVE. I think we understand what is countering violent extremism. How do we take these programs and push them towards a specific threat or a specific audience to actually prevent and counter? One thing I would offer is that, when I talked about, in my opening remarks, I talked about some of these programs. I talked about SAVE. I talked about Paiman. I talked about Furia Paracha. I talked about Malala Yousafzai. Each one of those represents the research, the prevention, the intervention, the rehabilitation, reintegration, and the counter messaging. But that's like one example. We need more. And if you look at the future of programming, for me, I would have like 50 of these examples for each one of these 5 areas of our objectives. And I would tell a quick story here. When I was in Pakistan, we were looking to develop local capacity for counter messaging. Some people really wanted to get some messaging out. And when you think of counter messaging, you're specifically countering the Al-Qaeda or the Taliban narrative. But a local implementer said we really had to do something with the role of women. So they came up with this concept of this program called Ugly Rutki Dastak, which means towards the next generation, or the next blossom. And it was 10 short-form documentaries on the role of women and empowerment, not just necessarily CVE, but empowerment. And, we told a story of the first woman mountaineer, or the first scuba diver instructor, or the Pakistan women's cricket team that actually does much better than the men's cricket team. And so these were stories that were told. And then afterwards, in our process of metrics and evaluations, we decided, let's see how this played out. And that tested the lowest. Absolutely the lowest ranking, and it created the most vitriol against these programs. We said, why? Well, it's simple. The people, our target audience, didn't want their women to be empowered. So guess what my next 5 to 10 years is going to look like? More programming like that. Thanks.
Yeah, I'll just pick up on a few threads there and say future programming should be analytically sound and contextually relevant. I mean, in my mind, those are the 2 main things. It should be based on analysis, and it should also be relevant to the local people who it's meant to impact. And I think that we should also, and when I say contextually relevant, I do not mean that we should forget examples from elsewhere. We should not look at some historical examples of things that have worked and see if they could actually work in a different context. And so, I mean, particularly in Africa, you tend to have a divide between what people see as violent extremist organizations and rebel groups. But at the same time, a lot of the underlying grievances are the same to an extent. And a lot of the mobilization techniques are the same. And there's a long history of what has been done in order to destabilize rebel groups and to, for instance, defection campaigns. So focusing on specific reasons why people would be mobilizing, and then essentially using that against the group. And this has been extremely successful with the Lord's Resistance Army, which now was out of Uganda, but now it's about 200 fighters who are in Central Africa who don't necessarily have the capacity to cause the harm that they once did. And also, just picking up the thread of women's empowerment, that we have a lot of really great research and information about different types of women's empowerment on the local level. And so if you look at women who are some way or another in charge of their local household income, if women are in charge of their income, they spend a higher percentage of it on their children than if men are in charge of the household income. And so if you're looking right there for a way to sort of connect women's role in the family structure and having them interact with their children in a way to prevent mobilization, we have knowledge on this and we really need to use it, but we need to make it contextually relevant. So that's what it would be great to see that.
Okay, thank you. And I know we've got some questions in the audience, so at this point I'll turn it over. And I believe we have microphones to come around as well. They're coming. If you want to stand up, if you think you can talk loud enough, you can try to ask.
Hi there, I'm Maddie Stokes. I work at the Center for International Media Assistance at the Democracy. This question is for Irfan. If you could comment on your what the challenges you see with the
We can do 2 or 3, yeah. Take these 2 at the front table, then we'll answer.
Thank you so much. I'd like to take a moment and thank our panelists for taking the time to discuss so thoroughly what they're seeing right now. My name is Dr. Laura Kaur. I am a visiting fellow at the American Leadership and Policy Foundation and team lead of their radicalization unit. My question is, well, I possess 10 years of experience in CVE and I wrote my doctorate on it. And I look at the room and I see so many thought leaders here. And we had questions about roles, silos, what do we see in 5 to 10 years? So how can we, in kind of different experiences in the field, help support you? How can we, either break down those silos, or how can we bring our research and experience to help empower programs to be more effective, and to make the next 5 to 10 years very, very good. Thank you so much.
Hi, my name is Rod Stabina. I work with USAID. I'm a Foreign Service Officer, and I'm an anthropologist first. I got my PhD in anthropology years ago. And I work in the Sahel. I've worked with OTI, the Office of Transition Initiatives in Afghanistan, and mostly in Chad and Niger. And CVE programs in the Sahel are very ambitious ambitious in scope, but limited implementation. And the project cycles are just 5 years. It takes 1 year to stand up a project, 1 year to de-scope. That's 3 years of impact. It doesn't leave very much room for actual impact or even study. Some of the engagements we plan, for example, that work with young women in the field and support civic society groups, Islamic society groups, or madrasas to try and get our CVE, counter-CVE messages there, or regional scope, are actually arbitrarily stopped because of contract officers and general counsels that don't understand the Establishment Clause. So there's a problem with implementation and policy with the Establishment Clause. Where do we see the deterrence when we have these issues? Because we get stopped in the field with these great ideas and great programs that Irfan and USAID has, but when we get to implementation, at that point, we're stopped. That's my question.
I'll address the Global Engagement Center question, maybe defer to others. So that's a great question. It's actually the one question we get from all members, not only just members of Congress, but our implementers as well. So I think if you look at the history of CVE across State Department, I think the fallback has been, well, public diplomacy and English language programs and messaging. That's CVE in a nutshell. So I think there's some truth to that, but obviously grassroots programs, locally driven programs are much more, I think, significant than just counter messaging. I think counter messaging should support some of the local programming that we have. So when you look at the wide breadth of activities across the State Department, not only from sort of our office and the other offices that I talked about, but there's a whole section called public diplomacy, and we have embassies around the world that have PD sections that do this type of work. So just as we had to get a better understanding of our roles and what we do and where our nodes of synchronization work, so too did Public Diplomacy Shop. So what they did, the secretary did there was, let's create a new center called the Global Engagement Center to focus only on the counter messaging aspect to it. And I don't want to speak for the Global Engagement Center, but I can tell you that our relationship with the Global Engagement Center is that we will focus a lot more on the prevention, the intervention, the research, the rehabilitation, the reintegration. But that fifth part of that strategic objective is solely in the lane of the Global Engagement Center. They work with all of us. All of us have different messaging components, but they are the sort of central node for that. And they're focused on a lot less of the content creation as we are, and focus more on the content curation. I think we understand that the best messaging comes from local, credible partners. So it's our jobs to find those local, credible partners and then connect them with the Global Engagement Center, who can continue to build their capacity and get the messaging out.
And anyone who wants to jump in on the other questions, please do.
Sure. In terms of the question of how you can assist in our efforts, I have lots of ideas. Because I've got a team of 7 people back in Virginia. So I will give you our email address because we are always looking for new ideas. We're always looking for studies and research. So our email address is nctc_DSOP, DSOP _CVE at nctc.gov. So we will take requests from communities for awareness briefings, if that's something, usually going out and working with educators or religious leaders, law enforcement, but we turn down very little requests to go out, and usually try to kind of balance our kind of geographic, priorities in the U.S. in terms of communities, but we will get something on the books within a few months. We have a domestic CVE task force that stood up recently in downtown, which is essentially after a 6-month Tiger Team review looking at all USG CVE efforts in the domestic space. And Irfan probably can also talk to this because I think you were involved a bit. So they will be standing up a website with research, with communication, in terms of being a hub. So I definitely would love to get everyone kind of plugged into that too, just to sort of be force multipliers, attending events like this, attending events on Islamophobia, on other just sort of issues. There's a Salam Neighbor, a movie tomorrow night about the refugee crisis in Syria, and it's sponsored, I believe, by DHS and USAID. So just getting involved. I can send you information about our peer-to-peer challenging extremism event. The final students, we chose 3 student teams to fly in to present next week at the State Department. So we will have room in the audience for that. So I will keep everyone gainfully occupied. Yes. Yes. NCTC _DSOP, DSOP _CVE at nctc.gov.
I can talk to, I think, some of the issues with regard just to our programming in general. And these are, nothing kind of that we don't think of across a wide range of sectors, including CVE and gender. One what she mentioned is the length of the program cycle. 5 years is generous. Many programs are not even 5 years. And so just when you feel like you're getting your feet underneath you, it's time to start packing up. And many of the issues that we deal with are much longer. I mean, even if you think about, Let Girls Learn, getting adolescent girls in school, right? Unless you're with her for 6 or 7 years, you don't even know if she graduated. So, I mean, a lot of the work that we're doing is more long-term, and the program cycle doesn't reflect that reality. Related to that is also the staff rotation in and out of tough places, like some of the ones that you mentioned, that the staff gets there, they get engaged, they're involved, and then it's time to go to the next post. Oftentimes we have uneven funding, places where, for instance, like the Ukraine, where we were pushing very much to stay in and do a lot of governance work. There were decisions made that we would cut back there. And so looking long term and being able to make those investments are important. I have to say sometimes USAID is very decentralized, and the weight and a lot of the power that we have is in the missions. And so when a DC initiative comes down, it might take a while for the folks in missions to really embrace it and see how it's relevant to their work, because sometimes we call initiative fatigue. It's like, oh, DC, we are not really seen as people who call to empower them. We're really seen to add to their to-do list. And so some of that. And then the learning, as was referenced, what you can do more of. I mean, we are constantly looking to learn and improve our programs as we go along. And so having, I think, some of the great convenings that have taken place since the White House one around the world brought together people who might not have otherwise been in a room together to kind of do that. But it is kind of a lag throughout USAID on how we take that learning, how we just don't go to the films, but how does that impact the program and help. And then I have to say, kind of on a broad scale, that we talk about CVE, and we talk about some of the programs that we do to prevent and respond to violent extremism, but we also don't want all USAID work and staff to be seen as CVE staff, which really puts them at risk in some areas. So I think as we continue to do this work, we will continue to be more clear about the work that we're doing, so that we're not, so that development folks around the world, not just for the US government, for other governments, are not seen as destabilizing or in any way putting them at risk.
Okay, next round of questions, Chantal.
Yeah, I'm Chantal Young-Artat of Women in International Security. I have a brief comment and then a question. The comment is actually, and it ties very well in what Susan just said. I was reassured, Irfan, by what you said, that ultimately in 5-10 years, you really think that we need to focus on the empowerment of women. And I was reassured because I have the feeling that a lot of the CVE programming that is focused on women currently has a tendency to actually reinforce very stereotypical roles of women and very stereotypical gender norms, with women as mothers and mothers and women in the private sphere and not being active in the public sphere. And I think one of the things that we're trying to push is to have a real gender perspective and get more women into the public sphere and not just the private sphere. The question I have goes to Susan. And first I have to say, Susan, I agree with you. And it's been hard to get some of the people of the WPS community engaged on this issue. And that's actually one of the objectives of these roundtables, to get these two communities talking. But my question to you is, you said that the programs that you are carrying out are really tailored to the local context. And my question is, how do you determine the focus of your program? You mentioned Pakistan, that is more focused on the government. In Mali, it's more focused on civil society. So how do you determine what the focus of your program is going to be, and how does a gender analysis actually feeds into that determination?
Hi, my name is Khurram, and I work with Creative Associates International, working on CVE. So I have two questions. The first question goes to Irfan, and I would like to know more about your CVE programming in Pakistan, because many times these programs they don't get the limelight and they don't come in the public any of such programs. And secondly, when it comes to monitoring and evaluation and showing results, it's always a challenge how to show impact of CVE programming. So I would also like to know how to monitor and evaluate CVE programs and how to show impact. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Amanda Florian. I'm with Accuracy in Media. This kind of touches on what Mr. Saeed said. So as young women become more involved, either as victims or perpetrators, how can we use technology to kind of shift that role from perpetrator to maybe a more positive role, like one that Malala Yousafzai is currently in?
So I guess specifically, as you know, Chantal, with all USAID programs, there has to be a program assessment before, and specifically a gender assessment to determine the best programs. So we try to engage very much with our local partners on the ground. And this whole question about how can we help you? It's kind of been a movement around development between USAID coming in and saying, we're going to do this, this, and this, to really the engaging our partners to help in that decision making and seeing what they think is necessary for whatever the development issue is. I think secondly, the question is who are the willing partners? Certainly, if you look across countries, the vibrancy of civil society and the strength of civil society versus the government, quite frankly, and is the government a willing partner? So kind of looking at who do we have relationships with that we feel like we could make the greatest impact. And I guess that would be the third part is, are there places where it's easier or harder to make an impactful investment sooner rather than later? And quite frankly, it's a bit complicated working with our missions who have 5-year plans, right? We are trying to be very intentional at USAID. Instead of saying we're going to do a lot of 17 different sectors, what are our top 2 or 3 goals for this country? And how can we focus on those in the short term? And so we look at that kind of overlay of those 3 factors of our partners, what people locally on the ground think they want, and then where we can be the most impactful. And then certainly with gender is woven into all of these and might be specific or integrated into those programs. And that's the last point I'd make in our gender work. We have this tension as well between making a standalone women's program or integrating issues of gender into all the work we do. And once again, that would be looking at the context. And we try more and more towards having less standalone women's programs unless there's a specific gender imperative, because we want to integrate gender in issues of empowerment. Men and women have to agree on this empowerment aspect in order for it to really move forward.
Khurram, to your question, I think if you look at this, some of the work that's being done in Pakistan, and it continues to this day, it's being done through this community engagement office, which is part of the public diplomacy shop in the embassy there in Islamabad. And the whole point is to actually engage communities to help them build resilience to not only counter violent extremism, but to make sure that they're building further partners and future partners. If you look at just the counter messaging aspect of it, I think you're missing the boat. A lot of it has to deal with engaging communities, building this interfaith dialogue. There's, I think, a pretty good program to make sure that the Sunni Muslim community there, the Shia Muslim community there, the Ahmadi Muslim community there, they are all having the opportunity to dialogue with one another. You probably know that in places like Pakistan, it's sort of this interfaith tension and intrafaith tension that's caused a lot of the roots of violent extremism. So that community engagement office, I think, in a nutshell, is trying to bridge a lot of those gaps. The main, I think, purpose of that program is to build the Pakistani community, the Pakistani mindset, away from apathy and get them more towards empathy. Stuff blows up in Pakistan literally on a day-to-day basis, and you sort of get, you tune it out. But to really make change, to really affect change, you have to really bring the after effects of that violence to the people so that they can get involved in the fight. I'll briefly mention the idea of technology that was raised. You mentioned peer-to-peer. I think that's exactly what needs to be done. These programs, the winning program last year in peer-to-peer was actually from Pakistan. And coincidentally, the program that won was called Fate, From Apathy to Empathy. I stole their tagline completely. But that's what they're trying to do. They're trying to build these types of programs through technology, through social media, not just create a video and put it on YouTube and cross your fingers and hope you get 25 views, of which 24 were actually in the embassy or us back here in Washington. You actually want to create mechanisms so that people can not only see the content, but engage the content. That's more important. In addition to the sort of peer-to-peer model, there's another model that Quentin Wiktorowicz and Shahid Amanullah have been pushing. And Quentin, those of you may know, was a senior director at the White House a few years ago on CVE. I mean, this guy literally wrote the book on CVE. And now what they're doing is they're doing hackathons around the world. And they're making sure that these hackathons, not anything illegal, sort of this concept of white hacking, where you bring a bunch of kids into a room and you have them develop these very social media responses. And what you're seeing is almost a 50-50 mix in these rooms of men and women in these hackathons. I think that's the future.
The only other point I would add is, I mean, we definitely have a growing public-private partnership and engagement. Also looking at engagements with kind of unconventional actors like Hollywood. Looking across the U.S., I always think a great local CVE program leverages what that community or that city does best. So a community strategy in Boston leverages the academic institutions that are there. A community strategy in LA looks at the leveraging Hollywood to get those narratives and not stereotypical portrayals of extremists. So I think just being really smart about it.
And anyone want to take the monitoring and evaluation question?
Sure. It's important. Thank you. No. So when you look at some of these programs, and you have to build in the metrics on the front end, and that's where the first strategic objective that we have is research. Part of that research is to identify where the problem is and how do you work the problem. So if the problem is a very particular village in a very particular town, but the problem has more to do with, let's say, poverty and education or lack thereof, and we're doing counter messaging through social media and internet penetration in that city is like, 3%, what are you really accomplishing? Nothing. So the front end is the metrics. Understand where the target audience is and what the problem is so you can overlay the programming. But more importantly, the evaluation. Earlier I talked about that program that we had done about women empowerment and how it tested real low. I mean, that's, for us, it was not only important to get the numbers, because if we had just gotten the numbers and walked away, guess what? We would have scrapped the program. But we got the numbers, but we also did the evaluation. We also got the stories. We got the understanding of why the numbers were so low. And that actually helped us identify why we should continue to do more of those programs, even though they tested low. And of course, when you go to your funders to say, listen, this program tanked, it tested real low, it had a approval rating or Rotten Tomatoes, rating of like 1%, but we want to do more. What is wrong with you? Let me show you the narrative. Let me show you why it's important to do more. Let me show you the research, why some of the gender inequality issues in this particular town are absolutely essential to countering violent extremism. Then you have a better story to tell. And you can only do that through the M&E. So all the programs we do across the State Department, and of course at USAID as well, through these 5 objectives that we have in the strategy, build in an M&E in the front and the back end.
We only have time for maybe 2 at the most more questions, and then we'll give each panelist an opportunity to say one more thing, and we're pretty much out of time at that point. Anybody else?
Hi. Thanks again for all of your incredibly insightful remarks. I think we've really appreciated all of you guys being very forthcoming with your experiences and what each program that you guys have awareness of contributes to this particular issue. My name is Corey Flesser. I work for Booz Allen Hamilton, and I think a theme that you guys spoke broadly about was the different roles each of your respective organizations plays and what you guys can contribute. I support a joint staff client. I've recently heard this phrase, military support to CVE, being tossed around. And I was wondering if you could comment on, from your perspective, what you think the military support to this particular problem or issue could be. And then if you can tie it into the gender lens and gender perspective, I think that would be helpful. Thanks.
Any other questions?
Thank you to all the panelists for speaking. My name is Molly Collins. I'm from State. And my question is about international initiatives. Since this forum's about policy, what is the line between how much the U.S. can do when the U.S. goes in and how the U.S. can bring its own initiatives, and where does the responsibility fall on local governments and local leaders, and kind of where that line is? Thank you.
Try to answer a little bit about the military question. It goes back to different ideas about what needs to come first in a particular situation. There doesn't need to be development. Who's playing which role from the outset? There is also there's also the issue of funding. right? And so you have a large amount of funding that DoD gets, and some of the initiatives in particular areas the DoD wants to do dovetails quite nicely with USAID and state. That said, there's a reason why the funding streams are different. And there was recently, there's been some, you can look it up, there's been some media about this recently, about sort of trying to perhaps use DoD funding to fund, I forget if it was USAID or state, I think it might have been USAID or state. And it looks like it's not going to happen. There are sort of opponents of this and against this. Obviously, it gets quite complicated, and you want to be able to raise funding for transparency and accountability purposes. But it just speaks to the wider issue of essentially what are we doing here? What do we need to do first? Do you need to have safety and security on the ground in order to make any real impact? They need to happen side by side. And so I think that there are definitely ways that these agencies need to work together. And I would say that not all of the DoD's tools are blunt tools. There are some nuanced tools that can be used. But has it happened, successfully? I'll maybe defer to the other panelists about programs that have happened to that extent, to that degree. But it's the security development paradigm, and it's not new. We're seeing a new incarnation of it.
I'll address the local government's question. I think if you look at what's happening across Europe, very clear indications that there has to be this bottom-up approach rather than a top-down approach. I'll point to two places in particular, in Belgium and in Germany. So in Belgium, trying to get a federal top-down approach next to impossible on any issue rather than just CVE alone. But places like Vilvoorde in particular, a suburb right outside of Brussels, they've got a very acute problem. At one time, they, I think, had the largest per capita number of foreign fighters leave to go, numbers of, upwards of, hundreds. I remember when they came here and they asked our number of how many kids from here had gone from the United States to Syria. We told them the number and they laughed. And they said, we have more going from our small village in Brussels than you do here in all of the United States. So we have an issue. And so how they tackled that issue was address it at a very, very localized level. It was the mayor of Vilvoorde, Hans Bonte, the chief of police, and his city council who decided we need to reach out and figure out what this problem is. So they worked locally. They didn't go back up to the Belgian government. They went down towards the local communities to figure out what was the issue, how do they better engage, how do they build stronger communities of trust. At the State Department, we helped by conducting these city exchange programs. So we actually brought this delegation from Vilvoorde to the United States. We brought them to places like Columbus, Ohio, to see how education, how Homeland Security how Homeland Security officials and how state and local law enforcement can get into a room. And in fact, I think they actually did one of these resilience exercises in a place like Columbus, Ohio. So those programs, we work very closely with our Homeland Security, our NCTC colleagues. In Germany, you have a thing called Exit. It's an exit program. It was built for violent white extremists to get off of this pathway of violent extremism and to actually exit these groups. So the German government said, well, that's a great idea, but it has to be locally driven. These local individuals decided we can take that same program and turn it towards these individuals who are being drawn to the ISIL narrative. So they took this Exit Germany program and made it into Hayat. And Hayat is the same type of counseling, 1-800 number hotline to get people off-ramped, to get alternatives so they're not going into this pathway of either going to Syria or ending up dead in the battlefield or ending up in jail for the rest of their lives or for the next 20, 30 years. So it's these types of programs that, again, were not driven by federal governments, but started at a very localized level.
On that program, so a judge in Minneapolis just a few months ago, instead of sentencing several individuals who were looking to travel and fight with ISIS, have reached out to the government of Germany to have someone consult for an intervention program for these individuals in lieu of sentencing. So this is sort of one of those kind of very locally driven issues, realizing that, let's try this approach and see where we get. So it's getting traction.
Okay, so we're almost out of time. About a minute or two left. So I would like to say, first of all, thank you. But second, if you could leave the audience with one thing that you've learned or that you've thought of along the way about programming and where we should take this in the future, what would it be? You want to go first?
Thank you so much, everybody. My one thing would be that this arena is enormous, right? And so we're talking about, I mean, the complexity of the local situation is really my sort of point that I like to hammer home, because the fact is, in certain areas, focusing on technology, focusing on Twitter, focusing on Instagram, that is a necessary component of to counter violent extremism. In certain areas, people don't have cell phones. It's about the local contacts. It's about the local grievances, right? And so just understanding how complex this topic is, and knowing, doing the research to try to learn what will work where, in what context, is, I think, something that I've learned, and thank you guys very much.
Exactly right. Go local. That was the buzzword we used in Pakistan. It's a buzzword we use now. In addition to the localized research, the programming has to be local. And I talked about some of these programs that start at a very localized level. Go local, targeted responses, targeted approaches, target audiences. If we try to solve every problem, we'll solve no problems.
I would say to be bold and be persistent. This is such a new space, and there's so much room for new ideas. In terms of just one personal experience, when we started our OD&I Women Council in 2013, because of really a lack of women leadership in the intelligence community in the U.S., we had to cut through ridiculous layers of bureaucracy, security, lawyers, everything. And really it was because we didn't have a lot of female role models to look up to, and wanted to create, mentorship, sponsorship, just an outlet for us to have real conversations. And we got there with a lot of persistence. So just, I think that very little is not possible if you're just bold and persistent about it.
So something that we talked about a little bit during the break that I never figured out a way to bring it back up in this broader conversation is the spectrum around gender-based violence and women, peace, and security, and countering violent extremism. And just in the last week, the government, we have updated and released the new gender-based violence strategy to prevent and respond to gender-based violence, as well as the National Action Plan on Women, Peace, and Security. And through both of these, we are thinking as we write our implementation plans on that continuum, and in how the presence of gender-based violence or the presence, because governments allow it to happen, because of those cultural norms that it's okay to treat women and girls in a certain way, or men and boys if they're not conforming to their gender norms, and how that is connected to issues of war and peace and conflict within societies. I would say continue to build those bridges and have conversations with that folks might not initially see the connection, but can really add a lot to both conversations.
Okay, and on that note, thank you all so much for being here, and thank you to our audience as well. Those were some good questions. So we appreciate you being here, and can we have a round of applause for the panelists, please? Okay, thank you.